Okay, well, thank you for joining us tonight, everybody. We'll wait for a few more people to follow in here. For those of you that haven't met me, I'm Trevor Freeman, and I'm the Public Programs Director here at the Western North Carolina Historical Association. And tonight, I'm excited to bring you a special program. It's the fourth event in our Introduction to Western North Carolina series that we've been running. Tonight's event focuses on tuberculosis and sanitarium, but also the tourism that came about as a result of this treatment of tuberculosis, especially in Asheville. And then also we'll get into how the movement for conservation in national parks and forests also came about as a result of this tuberculosis and sanitarium movement. Our speaker tonight, she's actually pre-recorded, but she'll be around at the end to answer questions. She's able to join us. Our speaker is Kieta Osteen-Cochrane. She's a national native and a local historian with deep roots in Western North Carolina, going back 8 generations. She was a former four-campus college administrator, serving as the executive director of the Institute for Business and Contract Training, and served on several local, county, and state boards in Cocoa, Brevard County, Florida. So Kieta joined the Preservation Society of Asheville and Buncombe County in 2010 and formed a committee to save the St. Genevieve of the Pines Auditorium. She later served as the education chair on the Preservation Society board for 6 years and was awarded 3 Griffin Awards for education and stewardship. As co-chair with Stuart Camblos of AB Tech, the alumni group raised a total of $300,000 to complete the historic restoration of the Ivy Building on AB Tech's campus. Kieta is currently on the boards of the Western North Carolina Historical Association, as well as the Guastavino Palaces for the People Alliance and the Thomas Wolfe Memorial Advisory Committee. A little bit of housekeeping right fast. As usual, if you're used to our programs by now, you know this is going to be recorded. It's recording right now, so if you happen to miss anything or you want to watch it again, you'll be able to view it on our website within just a few days. Now, this event's special because it's pre-recorded, but we do have a pre-recorded question and answer session where we'll discuss a little bit of the questions we anticipated people asking. But then also we'll have a few minutes at the end for live question and answers if anybody happens to have any of those. So you'll notice on the bottom bar of Zoom, you've got this Q&A button. And if you have any questions throughout tonight's event, just feel free to chime in on that feature. That allows us to keep all the questions in sequential order. So we'll try to get to everybody at the end. We may run out of time on that, but feel free, like I said, to chime in throughout the event if you do have any questions. And without any further delay, I will go ahead and get our video queued up and we'll begin tonight's program.
In 1880, Morristown, now Asheville, was a frontier town on the western edge of the United States, with a settler population of 38 souls. Beyond the Smokies and immediately to the west was an unmapped and a largely unexplored dense wilderness. Asheville was a frontier outpost where, legend has it, Indian trade routes crossed near Pack Square. It was so far from anywhere that Christian denominations sent missionaries out to what they considered a dark and mysterious region of pioneers, few, far between, untamed and unlettered, and in need of salvation. Western North Carolina was, of course, already most densely settled, and by an ancient culture of thriving people that had been there 10,000 years. They formed the Cherokee Nation. The tragic Cherokee and Indian removal of 1838 was still 54 years away when Samuel Davidson crossed the Blue Ridge into Cherokee territory, assessing the richness of the mountain valleys in 1784. He was swiftly lured into the woods by the deeply insulted Cherokee. Davidson was killed on the spot and scalped. His wife, child, and one slave, Liza, fled on foot to Old Fort. He was later found on the trail and is buried near Warren Wilson College. The legend is that the family was so grateful to the slave Liza for calling into the cabin that there was danger that they have named one child Liza in every generation since then. With him began the first permanent settlements east of the Blue Ridge into western North Carolina. He and many others had no thought for the value the Cherokee placed on the land the settlers coveted. The pristine high country in present-day Buncombe County was not only hunting and burial grounds, but was long an ancient Indian creek for the healing of illnesses and for spiritual rejuvenation. They recognized from the mists of time the healing power of the pure air and water. It was unspoiled high country, and the intrinsic energy was captured in the crystalline and magnetic granite mountains. That purity had not changed over eons. The change was coming, and fast. Meanwhile, back east and in Europe, a deadly plague had, since antiquity, killed the young with no hope for survival. Phthisis was the name for it. Consumption, also called the wasting disease, the white plague, the king's touch, because his divine touch could heal. And finally, it was also called the captain of all these men of death. It was named tuberculosis with discovery of lesions in the tubercules of the lungs. In ancient Greece, Hippocrates had been right in defining symptoms in lung lesions, but after that, not much progress was made. Tuberculosis continued from ancient times into the 19th century as the most feared, most fatal, and most prevalent of all diseases worldwide. Strong opinions on causes and numerous peculiar treatments had made no difference. Every culture had ideas on the cause, from spirit-driven demon parasites to dog demons living in the lungs, where the final anguished barking coughs preceded imminent death. More enlightened treatments later were tried, such as bloodletting, or hot glass cups on the skin to draw out toxic ethers. Various snake oil variety medicaments were used. Knowledge of bacteria was decades away. Oddly, Victorians romanticized the disease as it was the heartbreak of the young, the most affected victims. Fashion even glorified the emaciated look from weight loss, the flushed face, the pale skin, the red lips, dilated eyes, and the general weakness as extremely feminine. In a book titled Consumptive Chick, a book by Furman University professor Carolyn Day, she states that among the upper classes, one way the predisposition to get the disease was judged was by how attractive a woman was. Tuberculosis was seen to enhance those things already established as beautiful and desirable in women. Healthy women strove to emulate them in their pale, emaciated look. In 1722, an English physician proposed what he termed a new theory of consumption. Dr. Brian Martin suspected that TB was not inherited, but infectious, and caused by, as he described in astonishment, and I quote, wonderfully minute living creatures, unquote, later called bacteria. 140 years later, in 1859, Dr. Hermann Bremer opened the first sanatorium in the world in Germany. His was the first treatment with any success at all, just as the climate theory was taking hold. From 1884, Dr. Westray Battle, a former Navy surgeon, practiced medicine in Asheville and was medical director of the Clarence Barker Hospital in Biltmore Village. In 1888, he published a paper describing the climate treatment of disease with special references to the merits of the Asheville Plateau. Well into the 1900s, the 25% recovery rate for a climate theory approach, if begun early enough, was far better than 0%. Research continued, and in 1882, a breakthrough came. Dr. Robert Koch, a microbiologist who also identified the cause of anthrax and cholera, published his findings that he had identified and isolated the tuberculin bacillus, and that he had proved it was indeed the cause of consumption. Consumption being the frightening term describing the unstoppable progress of the disease. European and American doctors sought out Dr. Koch to study and/or assist with research. Noting that certain areas in the world had no tuberculosis, the climate theory had taken hold. These areas were actively sought out, and the lifestyles of the local people replicated in fresh air, diet, habits, exercise, and activities. I love to imagine our mountain sanatorium serving a robust and simple diet of collards, cornbread, and ham. Indeed, hiking, fishing, long walks, and so on were encouraged daily for those well enough recovered. In 1871, 12 years after Dr. Bremer opened the first sanatorium in the world in Germany, and 11 years before the cause was identified by Dr. Koch, one Dr. Horatio Page Gatchell came to Asheville. He was a Cincinnati homeopathic physician and a Christian Scientist with impressive credentials and experience. He chose Asheville to open the first tuberculosis sanatorium in all of the United States. It was located atop a hill in present-day Kenilworth on Arden Road, which was very far out of town at the time. This would eventually put Asheville on the map with a little help from famous patients and some new transportation. His magic mountain was Bowcatcher on Arden Road. In 1882, 17 years after Dr. Gatchell, also a believer in the climate cure, opened his clinic here, Dr. Carl von Ruck moved to Asheville with his family. You will, should you look, see many headlines of the time in the Asheville and New York papers, crediting Dr. von Ruck with creation of the TB vaccine and the TB time test some of us have taken. For all his dedication, research, and good work, this is not so. Dr. Koch and Dr. Mandu developed a skin test, but it was not reliable at all. Finally, in the 1930s, an American woman, Florence Siebert, PhD, developed a process to create a purified protein derivative of tuberculin for a purified and standardized TB skin test. She did not patent the technology, but the United States government adopted it in 1940. The TB skin test is still used today and has remained virtually unchanged for almost 80 years. Dr. Siebert has been recognized worldwide for the first accurate TB skin test, and she did not patent it because, as she said, quote, "We were just doing good work. That's all," unquote. Dr. von Ruck was born in Constantinople, Turkey, present-day Istanbul. The son of a German minister, he also had extensive education, clinical experience in the United States and in Europe, and studied with the now famous and much sought-after professor and Dr. Koch at his research center in Germany. Von Ruck was drawn to the now established reputation of Asheville as a highly healthful climate. There is a sticky wicket here around the vaccine serum. First, all serums in the discussion were derived from Dr. Koch's serum. Physicians often brought back a sample and experimented with it. Dr. von Ruck did claim to have invented his own serum. However, he did bring from Dr. Koch 1/2 ounce of serum to his Asheville laboratory. In his lifetime, he gave over 215,000 injections of his own serum. His son, Dr. Silvio von Ruck, traveled widely, giving it free to school children. Dr. von Ruck injected his 1% vaccine solution into the lymphs at the area of infection. It is not proven he created any original serum of his own. Dr. von Ruck continued his own research in his laboratory, and many physicians came to observe, collaborate, or learn from him. Over time, all the serums faced scrutiny in medical circles. Some were discredited, countersuits launched, reputations were questioned and ruined, justly or unjustly, in the race to claim credit for discovery of vaccines, treatments, and testing. Dr. Koch's own attempts to develop a drug to treat TB led to scandal and failure. However, a form of his serum is used today to diagnose but not cure tuberculosis. Some local sites of these controversies remain. Most notable, conserved and on the National Register of Historic Places, is the Von Ruck Estate at 52 Albemarle Place above Charlotte Street and at the base of Sunset Mountain in Asheville. In my childhood in the 1950s, it was called the Earl Chateau. I lived nearby and remember the peacocks that roamed the lovely estate, creating a lot of excitement when they loudly flew down into the neighborhoods. We are standing at the entrance to the Carl von Ruck Estate. In 1904, Dr. von Ruck bought this property, 20 acres of farmland, that contained two houses that were close together, two farmhouses. He joined the farmhouses with an elegant addition that contained a music room and ballroom on the first floor, and on the second floor was his laboratory and treatment center. The glass cabinets that lined the halls of his laboratory, the walls of his laboratory, are still there today. In the day, many celebrities came, famous people, wealthy people from all over the United States and Europe to visit here. It was the golden age of hospitality. The interior of the estate still retains its original oak and mahogany walls and staircase. The estate today is apartments and private residences. It is on the National Register of Historic Places. The first WNC Sanitarium on Furman and Chestnut had about 60 beds maximum. Contrary to what was perhaps assumed from newspaper articles here and in other cities, fire did not destroy WNC on Furman, nor was that the reason for building the second WNC at the corner of Spears and Otari. The original WNC was inside the city limits and subject to property taxes. The Spears Avenue property was outside the city limits and therefore not subject to property taxes, an ideal situation for that purpose. Both sanitariums continued operating concurrently, if only briefly. The city directory of 1900-1901 listed WNC at both Furman and Spears, but that was the last time the WNC Furman site was listed. The second WNC did experience a fire thought to have started in the kitchen. The fire burned hard for 4 hours. All patients and staff were safely evacuated and luggage saved. The headlines were dramatic, as was the devastating fire. On a side note, it was the first time the city used their very modern, newly purchased and mechanized motor fire truck. It was also the last time the city used the now fast-growing, obsolete, horse-drawn fire hose wagon. That was brought in because, on seeing the blaze growing fast, 2 firemen hurried to the firehouse stables, hitched up 2 horses to the trusted fire hose wagon, and rushed it back into service. The second WNC was rebuilt with 60 beds and several patient cottages, which brought the patient capacity up to 100. There was a farm and dairy established behind it, which site is now occupied by the U.S. Forest Service Southern Research Station. We are standing now in front of the historic Princess Anne Hotel. The Princess Anne Hotel was the dream of and was built by Anne O'Connell. Anne O'Connell was a registered nurse who worked at the WNC Sanatorium for Dr. Carl von Ruck. She was so respected by him that he actually financed the building of the Princess Anne Hotel, which was advertised to give comfort and respite to the families of those who were stricken by tuberculosis. The Princess Anne is only a block and a half from the Von Ruck estate, and it is directly across the street from the former site of the WNC Sanitarium. Anne O'Connell was a registered nurse. She herself operated 2 smaller sanitariums. How did she get to be called the Princess Anne? Well, she had long, flowing red hair. She was extremely charismatic and had enormous energy, and she had a very aristocratic demeanor and bearing. And so her patients and her staff dubbed her the Princess, hence the Princess Anne Hotel. This hotel is on the National Register of Historic Places, and it still functions today as a very fine inn, giving comfort and respite to travelers to Asheville. I'm standing in front of the corner of East Chestnut and Furman Avenue, directly across the street from the Princess Anne Hotel. This was the site of the 60-bed WNC Sanitarium operated by Dr. Carl von Ruck. Sold in 1929, the 3-story shingle-style inn has gone through several owners. It had been a World War II psychiatric treatment annex for Appalachian Hall and Highland Hospital, the latter famous for treatment of Zelda Fitzgerald and her off-visiting husband, F. Scott Fitzgerald. For 4 decades, it housed senior citizens. In 1995, it housed the Maharishi Ayurveda University of North Carolina in Asheville. The founders were spiritual mentors to the Beatles for a time. Finally, in 2003, preservationist Howard Stafford began 2 years of restoring the Princess Anne, for which he was awarded the prestigious Griffin Award by the Preservation Society of Asheville and Buncombe County. It is now a 16-room inn and is on the National Register of Historic Places. As a result of Asheville's growing reputation as a health retreat, both E.W. Grove and George Vanderbilt visited. Grove had invented a way to suspend the malarial medication, the bitter-tasting quinine, in liquid, and made Grove's tasteless chill tonic. This made him a millionaire, coming from a small town as a pharmacist in Paris, Tennessee. He came here for his mother, but stayed to build the Grove Park Inn that hosted presidents and built the Grove Arcade, among others. In 1924, Thomas Mann had published his Magic Mountain. To simply simplify this compelling study, it was a profound psycho-socio-political insight into the world of the sanitariums and that rapidly changing larger world. He described the pine-scented air, an air pressure at 2,200 feet of elevation, as perfectly matched to the human blood pressure and mountain hikes in the stress-free atmosphere. The Asheville paper, the Weekly Pioneer, encouraged Northerners and Europeans to visit, quote, the delightfully romantic and healthful climate with beautiful and accomplished ladies in great proportion, unquote. George Vanderbilt surveyed the land and purchased land including what is now Pisgah National Forest. His Biltmore estate is still the largest home in America. He was influential in so very many ways, inviting wealthy and influential industrialists, politicians, and friends to discover the highlands. The more that came here, the more came here. In conjunction with the railroad, Asheville was on the map. Rosemary Byrne is one example of how wealthy patients influenced the growth of the town. She came to Asheville from New York seeking treatment for tuberculosis. In 1913, she bought 2.3 acres from Thomas Rowell, the developer with his father, William Green Rowell of Albemarle Park. They developed the Manor Inn and cottages. Byrne employed Asheville architect Charles N. Parker to build 6 residences and rental cottages on her property, which is now called the Sunset Terrace Historic District. The building of the railroad into western North Carolina in 1880 connected Asheville to travelers from the entire East Coast. A journey that had been arduous and dangerous by carriage or car was now easily and comfortably made in a day or so. Tourism began in earnest. The story of the Western North Carolina Railroad into the mountains is both an incredible feat of engineering and a shameful part of its history, with the brutal and deadly use of black prisoners to do the dangerous work of laying explosives into the granite and laying track on the steep grade. The Saluda grade is still the steepest standard grade mainline railway in the United States. Now, sanitariums became even more prolific. St. Joseph's Hospital began in 1900 as a lung disorder and tuberculosis sanitarium. Located on a hill, where it still is today, it was remote, but not too far from the city, which had now grown in just 30 years from a population of 1,400 in 1871, when Dr. Gatchell opened the first sanitarium in the United States here, to over 14,000 in 1900. St. Joseph's merged with Mission in 1988 as Mission St. Joseph's Health System. Also in 1900, the Clarence Barker Memorial Hospital opened in Biltmore for employees and families of the Biltmore estate, with additions over time. Dr. Battle was the chief medical officer. It was named for a cousin of George Vanderbilt, and the original building, now the offices of Griffin Architects, PA. Following a fire in 1921, a new Biltmore Hospital extension was built between 1929 and 1930, and it is often called the Battle Wing. Merging with Memorial Mission in 1947, the Battle Wing closed its doors in 1951. In 1910, Dr. William Green Torrance established the hospital out of his Eagle Street home, which was later moved to 95 Hill Street. Tragically, Dr. Torrance died of the very illness he sought to cure in 1915. The city directory at the time listed Torrance Hospital and the later Circle Terrace Hospital as, quote, the only ones in the United States for colored people, unquote. By 1923, the Blue Ridge Hospital and Training School opened, which was also for Black patients. Both eventually closed. In 1918, a U.S. Army General Hospital opened to serve soldiers training for duty in World War I. 3 years later, it became part of the newly created United States Veterans Bureau. The primary focus was tuberculosis, and it was the only VA hospital in the Southeast devoted to respiratory illnesses. Colonel Henry Hoagland suggested the name be Osteen, an American Indian word meaning chief aim. As he said, every patient's chief aim was to get well. Today, it is the Charles George VA Medical Center. As an aside, after World War I, a patient that had served in France was suffering from lung damage due to chlorine gas exposure in the battlefield. He also had tuberculosis. During his convalescence, he taught crafts at the VA and also learned copper and silversmithing. His name was William Waldo Dodge, Asheville's famed architect and self-taught silversmith. An MIT graduate, he designed many homes and World War II defense projects around the United States. He moved his shop from the end of Charlotte Street to Biltmore Forest, where it stands today. Besides the VA, some sanitarium sites remain, most as apartments, such as the Otari Sanitarium, which is now the Coburn Apartments at the north end of Kimberly Avenue. By 1930, many physicians who had come to study had stayed. Asheville, therefore, had excellent physicians, but was becoming known as the city of the sick. People were getting sick from the casual contact with patients and their families. Formerly and heavily marketed as a health retreat, there was an abrupt change of heart by the city fathers. Enter contagion control. Health ordinances were created, such as banning spitting on the streets. Spittoon sales soared. Inns that had welcomed families and let their tuberculin patients visit now forbade patients from entering their premises. One builder even burned down the property he bought. It was contaminated in his view. He rebuilt. Eventually, antibiotics such as streptomycin were isolated in 1943 and conquered tuberculosis as well as other diseases. Clinics closed, but the reputation of Asheville as a health center and healthy environment merged with the explosion of tourism and propelled growth. Asheville's journey from a pristine high country retreat for the Cherokee Nation to the most prominent tuberculosis treatment center in America to a modern health center even welcoming alternative treatments is not over, and the story continues. My colleague Trevor Freeman will now bring you the connection between health resorts, tourism, conservation, and the push for conserving parks in North Carolina. Thank you so much for joining me today.
As Kieta noted, the climate of Asheville played a large role in the growth of tourism here, especially alongside the creation of a health industry. Their sanitariums and the climatic treatment of tuberculosis also contributed in a definite way to Western North Carolina's most popular and perhaps most iconic tourist draw, the conserved parks and forests that now cover a great deal of our landscape. Western North Carolina suffered under the ravage of industrial logging in the 1880s. At the same time, medical professionals began touting the region's healthy properties. One of the first prominent calls for protesting or protecting the forests and waters of the region came from Dr. Henry O. Marcy of Massachusetts. Marcy was an American physician, but he traveled to Berlin, where he further learned the antiseptic and climatic treatments from European experts. Returning to the U.S. in 1885, he delivered a speech entitled Climatic Treatment of Disease, Western North Carolina as a Health Resort, to the American Academy of Medicine in New York. He cited other physician experiences in the high, cooler, and drier air of the Rocky Mountains, and ascribed the same conditions here to Asheville in the Western North Carolina mountains. Marcy pointed to the freedom from malaria all over Western North Carolina, and also pointed out the size of the growing tourist town of Asheville, a population of 5,000 at the time in 1885. Marcy had been sending invalids to Asheville for 2 to 3 years by this point, and noticed improvements in their health. He also pointed to anecdotal evidence of Dr. Oliver Hicks of Rutherfordton, who noted that in his 20 years of practicing there, he saw older generations infected with tuberculosis move into the area and die from it, while their descendants were cured and TB was virtually unknown among them. Marcy also critically noted the great geologic and forest variety and beauty of the area and called for action to protect the regions from the advance of logging. He said of Western North Carolina, quote, "The mineral wealth, forest growth, and productive soil are in evidence of material prosperity to come. The pure air, water, and climate hold out a hopeful helpfulness to invalids from every land. The wise legislator, seeking far-reaching results, would do well to consider the advisability of securing, under state control, a large reservation of the highest ranges as a park." He then went on to say, quote, "Its indirect returns of monetary gain would be more sure than bonded interest, and its sanitary advantages would be of a value incalculable to millions yet unborn." End quote. Marcy was not the only physician who advocated for conservation, however. Enter Chase P. Ambler. The Ohio physician was recommended by the dean of his college, Western Reserve University, to work here in Asheville with Dr. Von Ruck. Ambler moved here in 1889 and became an assistant physician under Von Ruck. He then returned to Ohio and opened a private practice after Winya burned in 1893, but then came back once again to Asheville when the sanitarium was rebuilt, serving as the house physician at that time. Practicing in Ohio, the Von Ruck Sanitarium, at Mission Hospital, and in his own private practice at various points, Ambler was a busy man. Nevertheless, he would do perhaps more than any other individual in advocating for parks, conserved forests, and the protection of Western North Carolina resources. In 1894, Ambler, who was himself an avid outdoorsman and hunter, went on a fishing trip near Sapphire, North Carolina, with his visiting friend, Judge William Day of Ohio. Their conversation turned to conservation or protection of the forest, streams, and wildlife of Western North Carolina mountains, and Day urged Ambler to form an organization to champion this mission. 5 years later, Ambler began working with the Asheville Board of Trade, lobbying for this mission, before he helped establish the first organized conservation organization within Western North Carolina, the Appalachian National Park Association. This group met for the first time in November 1899 here in Asheville, and Ambler was elected secretary as well as treasurer. Ambler, a popular man with a knack for diplomacy and publicity, he used his connections, including those with President William McKinley, to raise money, to attract political and media support, and to gain public approval for the organization's efforts to establish a national park somewhere within the Southern Appalachians, or more specifically in Western North Carolina. Now, I should point out, at the time, the definition of parks varied, and some elements within the organization wanted more of a forest reserve and conservation with the allowance of cutting of trees or using mineral resources. Meanwhile, others in the organization advocated staunchly for preservation of landscapes and the attraction of tourists to them, such as we have in modern national parks. Ambler seemed to be willing to take a little bit of what he could get in that sense, and tirelessly promoted the organization regardless of the decisions made within. The Park Association's official mission also reflected both the health properties of the area and the potential it had for drawing tourists in its argument for preserving or conserving forests. Ambler stayed active within the medical field, publishing numerous medical articles and speeches over the next few years. The Von Ruck protege also promoted climatic treatment as part of fighting tuberculosis. He also worked tirelessly to promote conservation, even as the organization encountered difficulties. By 1905, the Appalachian National Park Association had changed its name already to the Southern Forest Reserve Association, indicating the changes in priorities. And it then folded in 1905 to be absorbed into the American Forestry Association. Nevertheless, its advocacy helped spur federal and state interest, as well as that among locals. And the resulting Pisgah and Nantahala National Forests, the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and several state parks and forests owe their creation in some degree to Ambler and to the movement he helped create. Ambler stayed active in medicine and outdooring even after this association folded. He later became the chairman of the Carolina Mountain Club in 1923, and the year before that, he opened his own sanitarium here in Asheville. The Ambler Heights Sanitarium was a 44-bed facility and took care of all patient needs, including the need for entertainment. Apparently, Ambler placed radios in every patient's room. All told, Ambler practiced in and served Asheville and Western North Carolina for 40 years. He died and was buried in Riverside Cemetery in 1932 with great public appreciation. Okay, well, thank you all for joining us for the recording of Kieta's program. And now we wanted to ask a few questions to tonight's guest. So, Kieta, if you're ready?
Ready.
Okay. First and foremost, what is the difference between a sanitarium versus a sanatorium? I've seen both of those terms used.
Well, you'll often see these used interchangeably, and there is a bit of a difference between them. The word sanitarium comes from the Latin sanitas, which means health, and it was more often used in the United States rather than in Europe. The word sanatorium comes from the Latin sanatorius, and it means health giving, and so you see them used interchangeably depending on what the physician that was in charge of which sanitarium or sanatorium, what his perspective was on how that word should be used, but they are pretty much interchangeable.
I think with that, there's that difference too in the European trained experts and American trained medical professionals.
Right. Difference in perspective on how they saw what they were doing.
Yeah. Okay. You mentioned earlier on, this is kind of an aside, but you talked about the Davidsons and the initial push into Western North Carolina. When Samuel Davidson was killed, how did the family actually know how to make their way back to the fort?
Well, I had read early on, and I didn't know this until I did a little research here. You always read, that Davidson's wife and child fled to Old Fort. Well, it turns out that they had one slave, and her name was Liza. And Liza actually was the one who knew the trail to Old Fort. So when they realized, Liza was the first one to realize that there was trouble coming, and she rushed to the cabin, and she alerted the family, and she's the one that led them down the trail that she was familiar with to Old Fort. And that's why the family, the legend is that they always name one child in each generation Liza out of respect and gratitude to her for saving their lineage.
I think that's a very interesting story about our history here.
I did not check with the family to see if that's true, but I hope it is.
Can you talk to us a little bit more about the design of the Wing Sanitarium? I've seen these etchings of it. It's this very large building, but what do we know about the architecture, design? What was the purpose of things?
Well, I'm not going to speak to the actual architectural description of it, but and I'm no expert on architecture, so there's that. But what I have noticed is that most of the early sanitariums or sanatoriums, usually they looked like hotels because they were built for very wealthy people. And you had asked me earlier, about what it cost, and that made me realize that I had never noticed any reference to what they cost, because I do not believe that cost was an object at all for these folks. But what I did notice in looking at many, many photographs, that most of them looked like hotels. So I think they were really comfortable. The rooms were more like suites in some of them. Now, some of the pictures you'll see of later sanitariums that were more efficient, they did have like hospital rooms. The defining feature that I noticed about all of them was that they all had the distinctive large, wide porches so that the people could get fresh air all the time and be in the sunshine and have the benefit of the climate, which was the whole point, the climate theory.
Right. That's very interesting. You mentioned about the cost of, we don't know much about that, but we see from newspapers at the time, every time a wealthy individual would travel into the city to stay in these sanitariums, it made the paper. They're in there with the plans and how long they're staying for. And so we know a lot of the people that did stay in them, money was most likely not much of an object if they had that, if they had the cash too.
Keep in mind they brought their families with them, so the hotels expanded as well.
Right.
And they were really fine hotels.
And, with that, with this tourism movement into Western North Carolina and so many people staying in these hotels, there's also a backlash, and you mentioned this, a backlash against tuberculosis patients. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, it was basically a pretty simple thing. People came, and then they came, and then they came more, and then they came in droves. And there were no regulations at all about where they could go or not. And the Board of Trade had marketed Asheville very strongly as a place to come to recover for all kinds of lung illnesses, specifically tuberculosis. And at some point, it reached a threshold where they realized, oh my goodness, we're making Asheville sick. And there was just like a skid to the stop about that. And a turnaround right away. And that's when, as I mentioned, they had some rules, and I don't know if they weren't laws, but they had established some regulations. And one of them, of course, was that patients could no longer come to the hotels and guest houses and inns to visit, and no patient was allowed into them at all. And then other things that I mentioned, the spittoons and so forth. Right. And so there was just a real sudden turnaround that Asheville was actually getting a reputation in the country. Don't go there because you'll get sick.
Right. There's an interesting ad I wanted to point out and share with that. So to Kieta's point, the Oakland Heights Hotel, which had been the former Victoria Inn.
Look at that, yes.
Here in the Victoria neighborhood near the Smith McDowell House, it had been a hotel originally and then was converted into a sanitarium. But by 1889, it was already advertising in the Citizen Times, no sick persons are received. I think later they said no consumptives are allowed. So a quick turnaround, quick change, backlash against tourism, tuberculosis tourism, that is.
So, Trevor, I know you've done some research on this subject. Can you expand a little bit on the Von Rutt controversy, where he was in a lot of hot water with the national medical associations and probably European too, accused of experimenting on children and other accusations?
Right, that's a really good point. He had allegations made against him at this medical conference in 1913 that he was experimenting on children. The year before that, in 1912, he had claimed to develop a serum for tuberculosis, and he was apparently inoculating children, orphans to be specific, in the Thomas orphanage. Apparently over 300 children were inoculated with his serum, and the allegations made against him were basically that he was haphazardly experimenting on these children. To his defense, he claimed that this is just an improved version of a serum that we've used for 20 years by this point. We know that it's safe and that it works. I'm just improving it and save lives potentially even with this inoculation. Later on, he ended up having the U.S. Public Health Service come and investigate his sanitarium here. And I'll give you a short quote. The surgeon A.M. Stinson was the one that investigated Von Rutt's sanitarium, and he found that basically his research produced a serum that was unreliable and unconvincing and even unstable, but he lauded the actual cleanliness and sterility of the estate. He said that their methods are modern and comprise those generally employed in the best sanatorium practice. So Von Ruck, he came out with a little bit of a damaged reputation from this, but it's still known as a very healthy place, his sanitarium was at least. I think one thing I wanted to point out is just the last caveat here is the interesting connection between the upper Midwest in Ohio and Western North Carolina.
On the railway.
Yeah, the railway, right? Because when the early planning for railroads was devised in the antebellum period, Western North Carolina was hoping to connect to the upper Midwest, to Cincinnati specifically, where there were meat processing lots and where there's more of a market for that. So the Drovers Road, that was connecting through Tennessee, was trying to make its way into Cincinnati. The same principle with the railroads. And then I just think it's interesting that that was designed to transform our economy and bring us into the market here. But then in the 1880s, all these upper Midwest physicians like Von Ruck and he said Battle, I believe, also was from Cincinnati. Chase Ambler was an Ohio doctor, and they all come here to Asheville. They're flowing the opposite way. And of course, with their health resorts, their sanitariums, they end up transforming our economy in that way. So I think there's a constant connection to the Midwest, to a larger region that we may not necessarily think of that frequently. But
well, it did. It opened up, the railway here opened up to the Midwest and the entire East Coast. It was only a day away.
Right. Absolutely. Well, Kieta, thank you very much for joining us. This was a very fascinating program, a topic that I think a lot of people are very interested in.
It was my pleasure. Thank you, Trevor.
Okay. Thank you to everybody that stuck around with us. I'm seeing a few questions and everything in the chat. There's also one thing I wanted to briefly bring up, because if you recall one of our earlier events, the Lit Cafe with Mary Athela Burnett, who is a native African-American from Black Mountain. She has a personal connection to some of these sanitariums here in Western North Carolina. And with her permission, I'm going to share a brief statement that she gave me about the personal connection. So she said that, quote, she witnessed the practice of African Americans in my community being denied medical care because of racism. She says, poor mountaineers of either race suffered from illness because they had no money for professional care. My grandmother could make teas and poultices and deliver babies, but her skills were no match for cancer and tuberculosis. She said, however, a white patient with life-threatening illness could be admitted to a hospital. A Black person could not until the mid-1940s and early 1950s. Some 75 years after the Civil War ended, when African Americans were freed from slavery. She says, imagine how many lives could have been lost because of Jim Crow laws and racial segregation in the medical practice. She goes on to say that the altitude and climate around Black Mountain began to attract more economically advantaged white tuberculosis patients around the first decade of the 1900s. A special sanatorium was built to accommodate them, and it was named the Royal League. This is in Black Mountain. She said her father and several of our neighbors worked there at the Royal League Sanitarium. They, of course, were exposed to the bacteria and then carried these germs back into their households. She said somewhere she has a photo of Black Royal League employees, and her father appears among them. She couldn't find it in time for tonight's program, though. She said that Black people were then, those who contracted the disease, many of them who worked in the sanitariums, basically had nowhere to go for treatment, especially if they were very sick. She said she knew of 3 tubercular patients, all of her schoolmates, from her neighborhood who were admitted to the Western North Carolina Sanitarium in Swannanoa in the 1950s. She said, again, that's another 50-year delay in the treatment for African-American tuberculosis patients. So, yeah, you see this weird dichotomy where African Americans are often working in these sanitariums, then with very few exceptions, not allowed in as patients, even if they had tuberculosis. So just wanted to share that with you right fast. We've got a few minutes left here to open up the door for some questions, and I think Kieta will join us also. So she should be able to chime in here. I'll make sure we're bringing her in, but let's see what we've gotten in the way of questions. Okay, so somebody asked if we can elaborate on the woman scientist who developed the time test. Kieta, if you're with us, can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, the only thing I can say about her that I didn't mention already is that she was a very altruistic person. Her research was pristine, and she made no money on it at all. Anyone who wants to look her up could probably find more. I don't know a lot more about her personally, about her life. I just know that she was a wonderfully altruistic person, and as she said, she was just doing good. She did not get very much recognition until years had gone past, and others, of course, tried to take credit for what she had done.
All right. Yeah. And I think, Kieta, you had a few, somebody had asked in advance of the program a few questions. Do you want to talk about some of those points that they raised?
Yes, this was a question that came from out in Montreat. Well, it was several questions. There's actually about 6 questions. So I'll run through them quickly. One question was, how many sanitariums were there, or sanitaria, in Asheville? Well, between the late 1800s and 1930, there were 25 in Asheville and 900 beds. However, those were private. The sanitarium at Osteen for the veterans had 1,000 beds, so there were 1,900 beds, 25 private sanitaria and the large one at Osteen. The VA and the Coburn apartments at the end of Kimberly, you can still see them. As far as I know, there aren't any sanitariums operating as a specialty right now that I know of here. Another question in that set of questions was cost, and yes, it was pretty costly. Several thousand a month at least, just for the sanitarium, plus expenses of travel and stay for the families. You had to be well enough to travel to Asheville to even get care, and well off enough to afford the long trip and the long stay at the sanitarium and hotels. So it was very expensive. Another question in that set was, how long did they stay? The average length of stay was a few months to get the full Karl von Ruck serum treatment. If you were in the, quote, galloping consumption, unquote, stage, that is the end stage, they encouraged you to stay at home. Some places might even turn you away if you were about to die, because there was really nothing much they could do except palliative care at home. Karl von Ruck, he clearly took care of some sick folks. When you look at the case reports, and some of them got sicker while they were there, that probably was dependent on how ill they were when they arrived. His published data, and there is a lot of it, points mostly towards people being discharged to homes stable or better. A very small percentage died in care here. The recovery rate question was a tricky one because they didn't admit hopeless cases at the better sanitariums, like Von Ruck. Nationally, there was a 25% recovery rate with the climate theory treatment. The majority of patients were mildly ill on admission, and the sanitariums did select for the more well-to-do, well-cared-for clientele. They were expensive. There was always a love-hate relationship with the sanitariums in town. that was a question on how the Asheville reacted. There was lots of community resistance to the Sisters of Mercy, for instance, putting up the sanitarium on South Main, as it was called that, then on the current site of St. Joseph's Hospital by the Sisters of Mercy. But the city was generally glad that Asheville was a civic leader in this medical tourism. But the neighborhoods responded with a not in my backyard attitude in terms of where the facilities were actually built. There was a question about how many were turned down, and I have no information on how many were torn down. Only a few are referenced that I saw in the research. But that said, E.W. Grove of the Grove Park Inn did not want tuberculosis sanitariums close to the inn. And that was very clear. And we think he made a neighborhood covenant against medical facilities nearby. So that answers that set of questions from Montreat.
Okay, great. There's one other thing I wanted to add with that to clarify on the rates for staying at sanitariums. I did a little bit more digging and found that, and this is specifically for Wynya in 1910 at least, so they were charging $40 to $60 per week in a stay, and then $25 for an initial entrance exam. So in modern terms, that is roughly $1,100 to $1,700 per week to stay there, plus what would have been about $700 for a entrance exam. So when we talk about people being, priced out, and obviously the people staying there money must have not been that much of an issue to them. You can kind of see that in more economic terms there. So we'll do just a few more questions here. I'm sorry, I don't think we're going to be able to get to everybody. There's a question about where Ambler Heights Sanitarium was located. And Kieta, do you happen to know that?
I do not. Is Ambler Heights the one that,
for some reason,
the only one I know about that was private was the one that we showed the picture where it said it didn't take sick people. That was a hotel, and
right.
that, by the way, turned into St. Genevieve Academy later, that hotel. But no, I will say, if people have questions and they want to leave the question, perhaps we can put answers up on our website when people want to go in and see it again. But I'll look up that. I don't know where Ambler Heights was.
Yeah, actually, I will. I'll go ahead and put my email address in the chat feature. So if you do have any questions, any follow-up things, just email me at education@wnchistory.org. And I'm going to take a quick second here to just give you a little rundown of our upcoming events, and we'll thank Kieta very much for her presentation tonight. She put in a lot of work and effort into this. So thank you, Kieta. Thank you for sharing all the very interesting things you found.